came here from LA. I was in LA last night doing a public event, and you know, Southern California is still really picking up the pieces from the wildfires. They were under mudslide alert when we left. Some communities were under evacuation. And then we arrived here, turned on the local news, saw images of flooded out areas, and highways that had collapsed, and mudslides, and families that had lost their homes going to emergency shelters. And these are very familiar images to me, because I've spent the past 4 years immersed in disaster zones. And you know, this isn't certainly not as extreme as some of what I've seen, but it is a disaster, and people are living it in the state in real time. And yeah, it does feel very familiar. It reminds me of what I saw in Biloxi, Mississippi after Katrina, or New Orleans after Katrina, or Sri Lanka after the tsunami. So we are going to be talking about disasters tonight. We're going to be talking about disaster capitalism. And it seems to me that it is only appropriate for us to begin this discussion by thinking about these disasters unfolding in this region, in other parts of the country, around the world, whether Tabasco, Mexico, Bangladesh. Oxfam issued a report last week about how the number of these extreme weather events had quadrupled over the past 2 decades. Of course, we rarely talk about the climate change context for these disasters, but it is real and people know it. Think about how, you know, when we see these images, when a community is living through these disasters, what our initial human response is. You know, this is one of the things about doing this research and immersing myself in disaster zones, is that it really exposes you to the worst that human beings are capable of, but also the best. Because the initial human response to a disaster is not to exploit it for personal gain. That's not what most people want to do. What most people want to do is they want to help. When they see it on television, far away, they want to help. That was the response to the tsunami. That was the response to Katrina. That's been the response in this state. And inside the communities themselves, as they are living these crises, people help each other. They help their neighbors. I mean, this is one of the great lies of the response in New Orleans to Katrina. You know, all we heard about was the looting. And people were so outraged about that when we were there, because in fact there were just hundreds, thousands of stories of the communities coming together and people risking their lives to save each other. And that's what people want to do. And when you go to talk to people who have just lost so much, what they want to do is they want to pick up the pieces, and they want to repair. And they also want to do better. They want to build something better than what they had before. But the idea that they can't participate in these decisions because they're somehow too traumatized or too victimized is a myth. In fact, people show incredible resilience and strength in the face of disasters. I mean, I met a woman in Sri Lanka who was 9 months pregnant when the tsunami hit. Her name is Renuka. I write about her in the book. She had 2 kids and 9 months pregnant, and she saw the wave coming, and she ran with, you know, the superhuman strength and saved her 2 kids and saved herself, and then proceeded to try to rebuild her community. So people are capable of enormous amounts. How we respond to crisis really is a choice. And you know, the message that I have is not one that we are inevitably exploited in the face of a disaster. There are choices at all of these junctures, and I think we need to remember that. But this phenomenon that I'm calling disaster capitalism is really the opposite of that initial human response that we've all felt. We want to come together. We want to help. We want to repair. We want to rebuild. We want to check and see who's around and what's around and how we can turn this into something better. What disaster capitalists see in a crisis is really the opposite of that. They see this phrase that comes up over and over again in the book, in this research: a blank slate, a clean sheet. They somehow confuse rubble with renewal. And there is this idea, and I saw this in New Orleans just 10 days after the levees broke, meeting lobbyists and local politicians. That famous quote from Richard Baker, the Republican congressman, who said, "We couldn't clean out New Orleans housing projects, but God did." That's what he saw. He saw an act of cleansing. I am in a church, so I would be remiss if I didn't go back to the source of so many of these ideas of great cleansings and ruptures and raptures and floods. This is a deep part of our Judeo-Christian mythology. This idea that, I don't really like the world as it is, so bring it on, right? Let's have a huge flood, and then I'll grab a few of my friends, we'll get on a boat, and to hell with all of you. I think that that's actually Dick Cheney's climate change plan, so far as I can tell. This idea that there's some escape, right? If we don't like the world, we just need to shock it, burn it, wipe it clean, and then we can start over. And Marcia talks about the importance of knowing our history, and that knowing history is revolutionary. And this book only scratches the surface of the history that we need to know to be resilient in the face of shock. This comes back to the myths that animate our culture and the myths on which this country was founded. A bunch of people didn't like where they used to live. They were like, let's start over. Let's find a blank place. Terra nullius, right? No one's home. Except, of course, there are always people there. So they said, well, this smallpox epidemic, this is maybe God's blessing, God's work, We couldn't clean out the natives, but God did. We've been at this disaster capitalism thing for a long time. And we are an amnesiac people. We are a people in deep denial about our history of genocide in this country. In my country, I'm Canadian, sorry. We did it too. And so we don't see the parallels. The way you become resistant to the tactics I'm going to be talking about tonight is when you can identify them when they're happening. And that's why it's so important to draw these connections. History is our shock resistance. So I'm going to talk about talk a little history with you tonight, and tell you a little bit about. I guess I want to tell you. I'm not going to be able to lay out everything that's in a 600-page book. I'm not going to try, but I'll tell you a little bit about how this argument evolved for me and how I came to the idea of the Shock Doctrine. The idea that our modern history, our contemporary history, has been shaped by this powerful idea that in order for the pro-corporate forces to get their way, they need some kind of a shock, some kind of a crisis that clears the ground, that readies the ground, that puts us into a vulnerable state, at which point you can have what economists call economic shock therapy. That's what the book is arguing. The origins of this argument for me came out of the experience. Marcia mentioned that the film that Avi and I made in Argentina. We went to Argentina after that country faced a very severe shock. As many of you remember, at the end of 2001, obviously Most people in this country were focused, they had their attention focused elsewhere, but it was a major international news event. Argentina's economy crashed in an absolutely spectacular fashion. This was a country that had been the model student of the International Monetary Fund. They had followed the corporatist rule book. They had privatized absolutely everything. They had deregulated. They had embraced free trade. They had become a country that imported rather than manufactured. They had decimated their manufacturing sector. They had cut every function of the state that helped people, like education and healthcare and social services. And the economy imploded. And the middle class lost access to their bank accounts. There was looting. People stormed the banks, pots and pans. You remember these images? So we went there, in part, to get out of here. And we made this documentary asking the question, once this economic model has been rejected, what next? What alternatives will emerge collectively? Because in Argentina, people didn't respond to that crisis by abdicating power. In fact, they responded to that crisis in a very different way than what the kinds of models that I talk about in the book. They responded to that economic crisis by completely losing faith in their political leadership. The chants in the streets of Buenos Aires in this period was, "Que se vayan todos," everyone must go. Right? It was you people who did this. Yeah. I think they have a lot to teach us, actually. And right before the crisis really peaked, in the crash of the banks, there was already a great deal of disillusionment. And the government was trying to deal with the economic crisis by cutting more and more, imposing a new round of IMF-prescribed austerity measures. And there were federal elections. And the candidate that got the most votes in those elections was a cartoon character named Clemente. People stuffed their ballots with cartoons of Clemente. And Clemente is a very famous Argentinian comic strip. And Clemente doesn't have any hands. And the idea was that because Clemente didn't have any hands, he couldn't steal. So therefore, Clemente made a more credible politician than any of the ones on offer from any of the political parties. So this was the context. And so people turned to each other. They said, we can't trust our political leadership. They're all thieves. They're all involved in this crony capitalist model. We need to turn to each other. So we wanted to know what the alternatives would be when people turned to each other, and we ended up making this film about occupied factories, about places where people had been fired from their jobs, and rather than allowing themselves to be fired, they went back to work. It was the opposite of a strike. If you think about a strike, withholding your labor, this was people unfired themselves, and it's quite interesting because if you think about the tactic, the traditional tactic of a strike, it's not a very effective tactic if people don't want you to work, right? So the idea was the machines still work, the equipment's still there, we have the skills, we've done this work, we can do it on our own. So this was a really powerful moment, not just in Argentina, but in the whole region. In Bolivia, they had just thrown out Bechtel, because Bechtel had privatized the water system and hiked rates up 300%. Made it illegal to collect rainwater, unfair competition. And really, in Bolivia, it was at the early stages of what ended up becoming really a national revolution that ended up bringing Evo Morales to power. They were in the early stages of that. Brazil, they had just elected Lula. In Venezuela, they had just repelled a US-backed coup d'etat against Chavez. So things were really happening in Latin America in this period. But across the region, it was a revolt against what Latin Americans call el modelo, which is the model. And everyone knows what the model is. It's privatization, deregulation, cuts to government spending. It is this package of policies that we've all been living with. And it was just crashing in Latin America. It was no longer possible to impose these policies peacefully. through free trade agreements, through the World Trade Organization, through the International Monetary Fund. It just wasn't working anymore. People were rejecting it on the streets and at the ballot box. So the idea for this book came from being in Latin America at this moment when the war in Iraq began. So here we were, and this ideology is crashing on the continent where it all began. And this is one of the things that I do in the book, is talk about how Latin America was the very first laboratory for these policies in the 70s, under the guidance of the so-called Chicago boys, the US-trained Friedmanite economists who worked hand in fist with the military juntas to impose these policies. So neoliberalism, as it's called in Latin America, was in crisis. And then in another part of the world, actually in the only part of the world where this economic model has not swept the Arab world, the Arab and Muslim world. It swept Latin America, Africa, North America, Europe. I mean, it's basically North Korea and the Arab world that remained protected. Even US allies like Saudi Arabia. 90% of Saudi Arabia's economy is in state hands. These are not countries that have accepted the neoliberal consensus, as it used to be called. So in another part of the world, this ideology that was crashing in Latin America is suddenly being imposed through tremendous violence. And this is what in the book I talk about 3 distinct forms of shock. And those 3 distinct forms of shock you could see very clearly in Iraq in this moment. The first was the shock and awe attack on that country, a military strategy that was designed explicitly to heighten the disorientation in the general population. What made shock and awe different from the doctrine used during the first Gulf War was that it targets the society writ large. That's a quote from the Shock and Awe manual. Now, immediately after shock and awe, in rides in Paul Bremer in his Brooks Brothers suits and army boots, the uniform of the disaster capitalist, and he declares Iraq open for business. And Bechtel's there, right, which had a particular resonance in Latin America in that period, Bechtel being there to rebuild the country's water and sewage system. And then Paul Bremer passes a series of laws that are exactly the same laws that had sent Latin America into crisis. Wide open to foreign investment, 100% foreign ownership of Iraqi assets, privatization. Then he assaults the public sector, right? They called it de-Baathification, but it was mass firing of public sector employees. So it seemed to me that the tactics of imposing this economic model had changed. The violence required to impose this economic model was increasing. Now, of course, the irony is that before 9/11, the desire to impose neoliberalism everywhere in the world was explicit, right? I mean, we were having an open debate about these policies. That's what the protests in Seattle were about. That's what the protests outside the IMF and the World Bank were about. But now we were hearing this mixed message from the Bush administration. Economics doesn't matter anymore. Security trumps trade, right? But at the same time, the exact same policies, accompanied by the exact same corporations, were storming into Iraq. And it was economic shock therapy through shock and awe warfare. Now, at the time, I thought that I was seeing something that was unique to the war, unique to the Iraq context. But after the tsunami, the Asian tsunami, I got an email. I'm on a listserv, the Via Campesina listserv, which is a network of small farmers around the world. And there was an urgent email that was sent out by the head of the Small Fishing Peoples Association in Sri Lanka, just a few months after the tsunami hit, I think just 2 months. And the subject line was "The Second Tsunami of Corporate Globalization and Militarism." And this email described how in Sri Lanka, which had been one of the hardest hit countries by the tsunami, 40,000 people had been killed, almost 500,000 people had been internally displaced, overwhelmingly More than 90% of them were small boat fishing people who lived on the beach and made their living from the sea. They had been moved into inland camps, and while they were being warehoused in these inland camps, their land was being given away to resort developers, to industrial fishing fleets, and so on. At the same time, and I went to Sri Lanka and investigated this, 4 days after the tsunami hit, the Sri Lankan parliament advanced a water privatization law. 4 days. I mean, the country is still underwater, parts of it, from the tsunami. The dead aren't yet buried. And here they are pushing the most controversial piece of this economic program, water privatization. And it was more than that. It was electricity privatization. It was labor market flexibility, and all of it. It was after that I used the phrase disaster capitalism to describe what I was seeing in an article for The Nation. When the levees broke in New Orleans, what started to happen is that people started to use that phrase almost instantly to describe what was happening to them in real time, when you immediately had this response from lobbyists and Congress people saying, great, we get the housing projects now. We can turn them into condominiums. And we have a document on the website. It's one of the most damning disaster capitalist documents out there, which is the minutes from a meeting that took place at the Heritage Foundation 2 weeks after the levees broke in New Orleans. The subject, the heading is 32 Free Market Solutions for Hurricane Katrina. And these are the minutes from a meeting that was attended by the Republican Study Group, as well as a network of representatives from all the big right-wing think tanks in Washington, hosted by Heritage. And they came up with their wish list. What do you think was on it? School vouchers. Let's not rebuild the public school system. Let's just give parents vouchers and they can spend them in private schools. Repealing Davis-Bacon, the law that required that contractors pay the prevailing wage. New oil refineries, drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve. And what's interesting about this agenda, much of it was immediately embraced by Bush. Another piece of the puzzle was turn Louisiana and Mississippi and the entire Gulf Coast into a tax-free, free enterprise zone, right? What's interesting about this is, if we think about what created this disaster in the first place, one was climate change, which is intimately linked to fossil fuel extraction, i.e. new refineries and drilling in the National Arctic Wildlife Reserve. And the other side of it was the neglect, the steady neglect of the public sphere, of the public infrastructure. It was the collision that we're seeing more and more between heavy weather and weak infrastructure. The neglected levees, the neglected and eroded public transit system that wasn't able to respond to the disaster, the failed state USA. And so the response was not anything that could be considered sane, which was, let's look at the causes of this disaster, let's change course in the face of the drowning of a major American city. And I have to say, I think that progressives share responsibility for this, for not being ready for this crisis with our ideas and our solutions, and having the confidence in that key moment to propose them and insist on them vigorously. So the response from the right was, let's have more of what got us here in the first place. Let's have more fossil fuel extraction. Let's use the disaster as an excuse, emergency measures as an excuse, and let's just destroy the public sector altogether. Finish the job, right? So if you go to New Orleans today, what you see is that the city has been turned into the country's leading petri dish for charter schools. More than half of New Orleans public school students are now going to charter schools, not because they wanted to, not because they chose to, but because when they were scattered throughout this country in a scandal they called evacuation, and what a lot of people in New Orleans called forced relocation or ethnic cleansing, their schools were taken from them and socially re-engineered. This is an incredibly anti-democratic move, incredibly racist, The fact that it was done in New Orleans, I think has to be seen within that context. And the largest public hospital in New Orleans, Charity Hospital, is still closed. And those public housing projects right now are slotted for demolition. And I think just 2 days ago, Bill Quigley, who is an extraordinarily courageous human rights lawyer and has been the leading public advocate representing the people who lived in those housing projects and has been standing up representing them in court, was just arrested 2 days ago for demonstrating against the planned demolitions of these housing projects. So that's what I mean by disaster capitalism. I want to talk a little bit about another shock, which is September 11th, which is really, I think, key to understanding how we got to where we are. I think retroactively, and this is, I think, why this book is resonating in this moment in the US, is that people know they've been living the shock doctrine since September 11th. That shock, that blow to the psyche of this country was expertly harnessed by this administration to push through policies that they could not push through otherwise. So I want to talk a little bit about, just because I don't really actually have time to go through the historical material that's in the book. The book is actually mostly about how this doctrine has been used in other countries and looking at how September 11th represented, in a sense, a homecoming, where this ideology that was imposed in Chile on September 11th, 1973, with the overthrow of Allende, and then the descending of the Chicago Boys, and Milton Friedman, who used the phrase shock treatment in his letter to Augusto Pinochet, saying you should follow this shock with economic shock treatment, and then it was enforced with a third shock, a shock to bodies, the shock of torture. That was the third shock that I didn't get to before. I look at all of these key junctures, how the Tiananmen Square massacre was harnessed by the Communist Party in China to become the super capitalist party that they are today. That act of terror created the context that allowed China to be turned into the sweatshop to the world. It so terrorized the workforce, sent that message of raw terror. And we don't talk about these events within an economic context. We talk about them through a very narrow lens of human rights. And what I'm trying to do in this book is ask the why behind some of these big human rights violations, some of the big human rights violations of our time. And one of the argument in the book is that in so many of these cases, whether it was Latin America in the 70s or China in 1989, we treat these events as if they are simply human rights violations, as if they are the scene of a murder. They're a murder scene. And in fact, what they are, the site of an extraordinarily violent armed robbery. That you need this violence in order to push through the economic policies that loot these countries. And that if you're going to rob a country, you do need to use force. That's why robbers often carry guns and use them sometimes. This is a violent process, but it makes sense. And one of the things that really drives me crazy is when I hear people talk about the Bush administration as incompetent. I don't think that they are incompetent. And nor do I think that Iraq is a disaster. Nor do I think the war on terror is a disaster. Not for everyone. So I want to talk about September 11th in this context, and I want to broaden it out a little bit to think about a little bit more about what shock means. Shock, we use the phrase fairly lightly. We say we're in a state of shock. We don't really describe what that means. A shock is a response to an event that we can't assimilate. It's an event that seems to come out of nowhere, and it is a rupture in our story. Now that can be on an individual level. It can be a terrible loss that surprises us and shocks us, and we lose our narrative. We lose a sense of who we are in the world, and we've all seen that, and many of us have experienced that directly. We know that state of shock. It can also happen to us collectively, and many of these events that I'm describing, a hurricane like Katrina, or the tsunami, or a war like a shock and awe attack, or September 11th, what they represent are events that are too big to be assimilated into a national narrative. And the phrase blowback is really important to understand in this context. 9/11 was a classic case of blowback. And what makes it a classic case of blowback is a CIA term, as you know, as Chalmers Johnson has explained, to describe the repercussions of actions that the US government took, but that were covert actions, i.e. actions that people didn't know about. By their very nature, they were covert. So when there is blowback from those actions, when there are ramifications from those actions, they seem to come out of nowhere because there isn't a context in which to place them. So the ramifications from those actions are particularly shocking. They are particularly surprising. So if we think about the collective responses to 9/11, it came from nowhere. Why do they hate us? Who are these people? It was the feelings of classic disorientation, an event that seemed to come out of nowhere. So shock is the gap that opens up between an event and our collective story. And our collective story is our history, right? It is the gap that opens up between our collective narrative. And when that gap opens up, we are very, very vulnerable. So if we think about what people wanted to do in that moment, what was the natural impulse? It was actually to gather. People wanted to talk. They wanted to talk to their neighbors. They wanted to assimilate that event. They wanted to close the gap between event and story. Because we humans need story, right? It's primal. And seeing as we are in a place of story, I thought I would mention that. And so people gathered, they talked, they went online, they went to bookstores, they went to libraries, and they desperately sought to fill that gap. So what did the Bush administration say? Go shopping, right? Which is the most isolating thing you can do. It's the opposite of that impulse to gather collectively and make sense of something together. You don't actually rebuild your story by going to Macy's. And the other thing that we heard was that impulse to look at history and try to contextualize this event, was to try to rationalize that event, right? That the very impulse of trying to understand, of reading Chomsky and understanding that the CIA had funded the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, that was an exercise in rationalization, not understanding. And to rationalize was to sympathize, and to sympathize was essentially to be a terrorist because you're either with us or you're against us, right? So we heard something else, which was actually history doesn't matter anymore. In fact, the message of 9/11 is that there is a new beginning point. We are year zero, right? And we started to hear these phrases, 9/11 changed everything, right? There was a headline in a Canadian newspaper on September the 12th, which was, globalization is so yesterday, right? All that economics talk that you were doing, all of that is so yesterday. That's all pre-9/11 thinking, right? So our whole economic and political analysis that predated September 11th was just banished. No longer useful. We were reborn. We were a blank slate. And because we need stories, because this is such a human impulse, we were particularly receptive when news stories were handed down to us with nice little bows tied around them, like Axis of Evil and Clash of Civilizations and the war against Islamofascism, with lots of help from the media, who also don't like to be without a story for very long, seeing as they are the official storytellers of our culture. So they were happy. Our mainstream journalists were happy to parrot these new narratives, these insta-narratives. Now, We know what the Bush administration did with the incredible faith that was placed in it in that moment. And one of the classic symptoms of a state of shock is regression. It is that childlike state that opens up. And one of the things I do in the book is I look very closely at the CIA's interrogation manuals, where they describe all their interrogation techniques as a system of inducing regression. And they say that when a prisoner goes into a state of shock, a window opens up, a kind of suspended animation, when they are more likely to comply. And they're more likely to comply because they start to see their interrogator as a father figure. And when I read this, all I could think of was Rudy Giuliani. And I mean, this is what I mean by the fact that we've been living the shock doctrine. We have we remember that regression. Whether we felt it ourselves or we saw it in our friends and relatives, we remember it. And we regret it, most of us regret it, although some of us want to relive it. And that's why Giuliani has a base now. His entire election campaign seems to be, remember when I was your daddy? So we spend a lot of time now retroactively piecing together the extraordinary powers that were seized by the Bush administration in that period, through the Patriot Act, through warrantless wiretapping, through the right to wage preemptive war, the opening of Guantanamo, all of these measures. And that's really important that we're going through this process. But I still think we're missing a larger story. And that is the war on terror that was declared in this period, and the super empowered security state that the Bush administration has created through the special powers that they claim to put people under surveillance, use indefinite detention, the classification of enemy combatants, the waging of preemptive wars, the launching of the Department of Homeland Security. All of it actually doesn't make sense as a war. We understand that, right? I mean, we understand that you can't win a war against evil everywhere forever, right? We joke about that, but we understand that from a military perspective, this is an unwinnable war. But if you think about it in a different way, it starts to make more sense. If you think about it actually as a business plan that the Bush administration gave to corporate America after 9/11, and that 9/11 sort of acted as a kind of an IPO, launching a new economy, right? That in the same way that the internet launched the dot-com bubble, the 9/11 launched a security bubble. Because the part of this that we still haven't fully grasped, even though we talk about individual contractors and individual corruption scandals like Halliburton and Blackwater and Bechtel, what we haven't grasped is that this entire infrastructure that we're calling the war on terror, whether it's being fought abroad in Iraq or at home through this super empowered security state, is a hollow shell. It is fully privatized. Everything that can be outsourced and privatized has been outsourced and privatized. This is the end point of the privatization agenda that we've been living with for 25 years. They've already privatized all of the arms of the state. All that's left is the core. The core is the army, the border control. The core is the running of the government itself. So this first stage was the super empowering of the security state, of those core state functions. But the second stage was the simultaneous privatizing of them. Now, one of the advantages of this is that you actually don't have to debate any of this, because it's all taking place under cover of the war on terror, which is, of course, covered under national security. And the Bush administration had a blank check to wage that war however they wished. So we find out about this in glimpses, in bits and pieces, retroactively through an individual scandal. Through the Blackwater scandal or through the Abu Ghraib scandal, we find out that even prisoner interrogation has been privatized. But we don't get the full picture, and that's the advantage of using shock and crisis to push through these policies. They create states of emergency where democracy can be circumvented and pushed aside. So if you think about it as a military plan, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But as an economic program, it makes a lot of sense. I think what we need to understand is the Bush administration, they're not an administration. They don't administer. They think other people should do that. They've outsourced administering. And the role they have played in the war on terror is not that of an administrator, but that of a venture capitalist, of a deep-pocketed venture capitalist that says, okay, here's your business plan. Here's your market. Fight evil everywhere forever. Okay. Terrorists and immigrants too, while you're at it. Diversify. And we have your startup money, unlimited public funds, with absolutely no oversight or accountability because it's all being spent in the name of security. And then it starts to make a lot more sense. Because from a business perspective, what you want is predictability, stability. You don't want to invest in a market if it could end, right? If it could end tomorrow, if this is some sort of flash in the pan war. No, you want to know that this war is going to go on and on and on and on. And if you decide to diversify your interests, like a company like Halliburton, for instance, which has been diversifying into the immigration holding business, they got a big contract to build detention centers in the case of an emergency influx of immigrants, which is actually a veiled response to reference to climate change. Because that's the sort of context in which you get an emergency influx of people. You have Blackwater, which showed up in New Orleans after Katrina, ready to diversify after Iraq and there to provide security, as they said, for FEMA. During the California wildfires, Blackwater's been very, very present there. They're interested in getting into the humanitarian relief business. So they're also interested in getting into the genocide prevention business. They want to go to Darfur. But so what threatens this whole new economy that has sprung up in the aftermath of 9/11 is peace, is that we could actually respond to our climate catastrophe through real political and economic action, like actual caps on emissions, and that we could decide collectively that we want to get off this disastrous course. We could take real action, like saying the Alberta tar sands, I don't know if you know about this, but should not be developed. I mean, that this is and we are continuing on this disastrous course. And I know we're going to have a lively question period here, but I think it's important to understand that to keep the disasters coming, all you have to do is nothing, right? You don't actually need to plan it. This economic model is a disaster. It is a disaster, and it will keep the disasters coming at us without any conspiracies required. This market model that we have of casino capitalism, of deregulated markets, will continue to create bubbles like the subprime mortgage one, and then crises that can then be exploited to push through policies that you can't push through during normal times, like privatization of Social Security and charter schools and school vouchers. Each one of these crises presents an opportunity, but just by doing nothing, just by refusing to regulate the market, you will keep having these boom and bust cycles. Just by doing nothing in the face of this ongoing crisis of climate change, we will continue to have ever more intense natural disasters, which can then be exploited in the ways that I've been describing. And by refusing to develop alternative energy sources and changing the way we live, we will have to fight more wars over scarce natural resources, scarce fossil fuels. And there will continue to be blowback from those resource wars. So just by doing nothing, this market is banking on us doing nothing. And just by doing nothing, the disasters will keep on coming. So that's what we're up against. Now, I think what's important to understand is that what's fueling this economy is fear. It's our complicity, and it's our willingness to be afraid all the time, and that is why a Giuliani figure is successful. The promise of the state giving us total security, which is a promise that they can't make, especially not if they're that they can grant. Also, the fear of immigrants is fueling this economy, and we can talk more about that. The fear of climate change is now fueling this economy. I mean, I wrote a column recently called Rapture Rescue 911 because I used to think that what was wrong is that this administration was run by a group of people who really believed the rapture was coming in their lifetime and that they and their friends were going to be airlifted out of here. And so it really didn't matter. And now I actually think that what they're doing is they're reenacting it down here. They're not waiting. You know, heaven can wait. We'll just have the rapture right down here. And the privatization of disaster response, what we're seeing leap forward. There's a company in Florida called HelpJet that markets itself, turn your hurricane into a luxury vacation. During the California wildfires, we saw something that we haven't seen in a couple centuries, which is private firefighters working for insurance companies, spraying down houses for the people who had paid very high insurance premiums, spraying down houses with fire retardants while the houses right next door burned down. So, I mean, we're living this. We were actually creating a sort of a rapture context, except for it's not about if you can pray, it's about if you can pay. And if you pay for these extra services, you will be saved from the worst of these disasters. And at the same time, we're creating an economy that is about containing the discarded people. The people displaced by these disasters, privatizing the detention centers, privatizing the surveillance. So you have the privatized containment and the privatized rescue simultaneously. So this is what we're up against. And you know, I do think, as Marcia said, that it is a revolutionary moment because people see this. It's becoming very, very naked. And the fact that there are so few people who are actually defend this on ideological grounds anymore is quite interesting because it is just indefensible, and it is exposing this whole era that we have been living in as a revolt of the elites, a class war waged by the rich against the poor, a revolt against the New Deal and all of the policies that were put in place so that there would not be the kind of scenes that we saw in 1929. I mean, people demanded something different in the face of that crisis, of the market crash. And that was a different kind of response to disaster. That was disaster collectivism, if you will. That's what the New Deal was. And this whole era has been about dismantling that process. So it's that naked. I just want to finish with an example of another way of responding to crises. As Marcia mentioned, the book's come out in a bunch of languages, including Spanish, and I was in Madrid recently launching the book. And it was a really interesting time to be there because they were just handing down the verdicts for in the terrorist attacks that took place on March 11th, 2004, those horrific attacks on the trains. And it was really interesting to be there in that moment because, first of all, they had allowed their court system to deal with this terrible crime. They hadn't abandoned the Geneva Conventions. They hadn't kidnapped people and taken them to secret prisons. It was in the open court system, and they had just handed down verdicts. And there were media allowed in the courtroom. All kinds of crazy things were going on there. And so it was an interesting time to talk to people about that event. And people in Spain refer to it as their 9/11. But they reacted to it completely differently. And I just want to remind you, because I think some of you remember and some of you probably don't. The day after those attacks, well, immediately after the attacks, actually, Spain at the time had a very right-wing president named José María Aznar. A big Bush ally, went into Iraq, with Bush against the wishes of his people. Immediately after the attack, Aznar just started doing his best Bush impersonation, which meant using the attack instantly to political advantage, just nakedly. He blamed ETA, the Basque separatists, with no evidence whatsoever. And then he also said, and this is why we're in Iraq, because these people want to take away our freedom, which made no sense. I mean, if it was ETA, then what does it have to do with Iraq? But it was, the free association, Bush style. And so people were watching this, and the response was instant. The day after the attacks, Spaniards took to the streets in huge demonstrations. And it's really important to remember how frightening it was to do that in this moment. They didn't know who was behind the attacks, and they were still out there. And so the idea of people gathering, I mean, when you gather together, you're a target, right? And so it was in defiance of fear that people gathered. And in fact, they described the marches as marches not against Aznar, but marches against fear. And it's very interesting, if you think about that idea, to have a march against an emotion. Your emotion, right? An emotion within yourself, identifying the enemy within. And the enemy within is fear. And then it just so happened, lucky them, that they were having elections the next day, the day after that. And people were able to instantly act on their rejection and their disgust at the way these events were being exploited. And they voted overwhelmingly against Aznar's party and voted in Zapatero, who was promising, running on a platform of pulling troops out of Iraq. And they did pull troops out of Iraq. Imagine that. And so when we were in Spain, I asked a lot of people, why was it that people responded so spontaneously, so without any organization, so powerfully to what Aznar was doing? And we got the same answer again and again. Aznar reminded us of Franco. And so, what's so interesting about that story, to me, is first of all that they identified fear as their enemy, even though they had every reason to be afraid, right? There is no guarantee. None of us are guaranteed a life without fear. The idea of security is a myth. None of us get it. And they gathered because they knew there was strength in numbers. They knew they would be stronger together than apart. And what allowed them to do this was their collective knowledge of history, their collective metabolizing of a past of terror. And more than that, that Spaniards had done the hard work of history, right? That they weren't living with the fairy tale version of history. They were remembering their own complicity, their own collective complicity with the Franco regime, remembering how, in an earlier era, they and their parents and grandparents, some of them, had given into that desire for security and given up their democracy in the process. And so because they had done that work of history, they didn't lose their story. They had a story in that moment of crisis. They didn't go into shock. It was shocking, but they didn't go into shock. They had that collective story. And it was history, really, that saved them. So as we think about how we can be shock resistant, we know we can't keep the shocks from coming, but we don't have to regress. We don't have to give in to our fear. We can study history, and that will allow us to recognize patterns instantly. It's our roadmap. And we will see the early warning signs instantly, and we will be able to react, and we'll be able to resist. So I want to thank you very much. I've talked a long time, but we still have time for questions. History is our story. It's our shock resistance. So thank you for remembering a little bit with me tonight.
You've been listening to a presentation by journalist and author Naomi Klein, talking about her latest book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the program. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, and author. Her books include the international bestseller, No Logo, Taking Aim at the Brand Bullies. With over 1 million copies in print, this book, Naomi Klein's first, was translated into 28 languages. And Fences and Windows, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Globalization Debate. Naomi Klein is a regular contributor to The Nation magazine and the British newspaper The Guardian. In 2004, she released The Take, a feature documentary about Argentina's occupied factories, co-produced with director Avi Lewis. And now we return to the question and answer segment from the program. Faced with a long line of people waiting to ask questions, Naomi Klein would listen to 2 or 3 and then address each of the points or questions raised. One of the first questions was why it took so long for Naomi Klein to visit Portland. Another audience member observed that Naomi Klein writes about resistance in other countries, of how people in other countries are fighting to defend themselves. Is this the most we can expect? What can be done at a global level to dismantle the Shock Doctrine philosophy of privatization? And what can be done to reverse the process, to roll back the victories of disaster capitalism? The next question is about how U.S. history is debated, how events in U.S. history are denied or reinterpreted in radically different ways. Can you comment on the struggle over the facts and interpretation of U.S. history? The next member of the audience asked about racism in the United States. It was, this audience member claimed, the introduction of a National Football League team to New Orleans that started the process of desegregation. With regard to the economic context, this audience member had worked in Saudi Arabia for many years. Working in Saudi Arabia, there was a time when it cost more to put air and water in your car than it did to fill up the tank with gas. It cost 17 cents per barrel to produce the oil, and now it's over $100 a barrel.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to, and I think it's fine for people to make brief comments, because I'm not going to be able to answer all of these questions, as you can see, and I can't answer a lot of these questions. The point about the price of oil, it's something as a Canadian that I've been thinking a lot about, because as you may have heard, the Canadian dollar is on par with yours, or I think we might be a little stronger. And a lot of that is because your economy is tanking, but a lot of it is because Canada is in the midst of a disaster capitalism boom, and that has to do with the fact that we have discovered oil. And we discovered oil because, ironically, because Iraq was invaded. And because Iraq was invaded, the price of oil soared. And Alan Greenspan has now told us that Iraq was invaded for its oil. But interestingly, they haven't really quite been able to get their hands on that oil yet, although they're doing their best and they're getting a good start in Kurdistan. But because of that instability and the price of oil going so high, in many other parts of the world, you have an oil boom going on that would be economically unfeasible were it not for that instability. So it's this domino effect, and as Baghdad burns, Calgary booms, and it booms because the oil in Alberta is embedded in the sand, is in the tar, and so it was economically unfeasible before 2003 for the big oil companies to invest in processing that oil, so they didn't count it as much of it as an oil reserve, because it just didn't make economic sense. But now it does. So now we have this incredible oil boom going on, and it's intimately linked. And when I was in Calgary, I was speaking in a room the size of this. I said, what is the one thing that can threaten your economic boom? And they all yelled out, peace. I mean, people know how intimately connected their economy is to disaster. This book is not a book of prescriptions. Yeah, and in terms of why it took me so long to get to Portland, it took me 4 years to write this book, and I did very little public speaking. After No Logo, I did a lot of public speaking for a couple of years, and then I just decided I'm not going to stand on podiums until I've done the work to deserve to be there again. And I think sometimes it happens that people just stay on the circuit, and the reason why you're looked to for new information sort of fades away because you don't spend the time to do that research. So I take it really seriously about what I'm qualified to speak on, and the research that I did in the book that I produced is not a book of prescriptions of here is where we're going now. I do have ideas, but I don't actually think I'm any more qualified than any of you to answer it. I think that, and I think we all actually do know the solutions. And I actually think what we face much more than a lack of solutions is a lack of confidence and lack of faith in our solutions. So part of the reason why I believe that this book, although it's despairing, is actually empowering, is because when you see the way shocks and crises was used at all of these key junctures to impose this disastrous economic model, this system of dispossession and inequality. It challenges the central and most dangerous fairy tale of our time, which is that we got this ideology because we wanted it, because we demanded it, right? And that is a very disempowering message. And the flip side of that is there is no alternative, right? So what I'm showing in the book is that, first of all, people didn't want this. They voted for other things at very key moments, whether in South Africa in 1994, or Solidarity in Poland in 1989, or Chile in 1970 for Salvador Allende. And these shock tactics have been used to get those alternatives out of the way. And they are basically variations on democratic socialism and cooperative workplaces. And this attempt to reconcile the desire to have freedom in our choices and to pool our collective resources and live in dignity is, we've been trying to have this, to get it right for a really long time now, and this economic project has really been about eliminating those alternatives and claiming there are really only two choices: totalitarian communism and savage capitalism, and nothing in between. So I'm just trying to show all the roads not taken, and I think we can choose from them. And what we need to make the right choices is confidence. And what hurts our confidence is that we believe our ideas are tainted. We believe there's something wrong with our ideas. We believe that they've already been tried and failed. So when we understand the history better, we actually see that they were shocked out of the way before we even got a chance to try them. Now, in terms of so there are many things we can do, but I just think we already know them. I mean, you watch Sicko, look at Canada. You can have a public health care system, You can invest in public infrastructure. You can send back your tax rebates and have a public library system, in this state. Like, it's not rocket science, and I also think we know what we need to do in the face of climate change, and so I'm trying to point at some of the reasons why we have a leadership that is totally casual in the face of catastrophe, and why we need to be much more urgent in proposing our alternatives. But you raised the issue of truth and accountability and what can be done right now. And I have to say that the countries that are more shock resistant have gone through a process of truth commissions, of official truth-telling. I mean, the contestations of history, I know exactly what you mean. And it is really unique to this context that there's almost nothing that can be collectively agreed upon about what happened, whether it's about slavery, whether it is about the genocide against indigenous people, as you say, whether it's about labor history, whether it's about the New Deal. I mean, absolutely everything is contested. So people just decide to not remember, right? Because it's easier. And if you even think about the inability to have a memorial at Ground Zero in New York, it was over this battle over how to remember and how to define freedom and what would be in the memorial, right? So this is so contested, and that's actually why I think it would be a really great thing to impeach George Bush. I really do. Because, I mean, we can tell the truth to each other all we want, but it's the official truth-telling, right? It's getting it down on the record and there being consequences for the truth that this country so desperately needs. I think it's the beginning of the process, but it's a really good beginning. So, yeah.
The next question is about what the shock doctrine looks like at the local level, specifically with regard to school funding and politics here. Locally, there are moves towards privatization. Most notably, the school custodians were fired 4 years ago. They were rehired recently, but now face a 30% wage cut. Can you talk about how crisis capitalism is working at the local level?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think we see it on a micro level all the time, where the system, the policies, deregulation, cuts to government spending in the social services and healthcare and education, and privatization. These aren't isolated, right? You cut spending to healthcare and education, and you create the crisis that you then solve with privatization. So, I mean, these are mini shock doctrine cycles all the time. And that just reminds me of just one other, okay, that I'll come back to the larger point about the fact that you're on the front lines of this struggle. But thank you so much for your comment.
The next question has to do with Naomi Klein's discussion of psychiatric shock treatment, euphemistically called electroconvulsive therapy, referring to a passage in the shock doctrine that states that the psychiatric use of shock treatment has now been refined so that it ensures the safety and comfort of the patient and has become a safe and effective treatment for psychosis. This member of the audience takes exception to this, stating that it is not universally accepted.
Yeah.
Okay, so
thank you.
Hopefully you talk more.
You know, I have to tell you, that was a contested paragraph in the book.
I feel better already.
Yeah. Thank you.
I also have a question.
Yeah.
The next question from the same member of the audience is about fiscal conservatives, including ideologues like Grover Norquist, who may be angry about the size of government and the deficit and the number of federal employees. Have you encountered any of these people, fiscal conservatives, who object to the policies of the Bush administration on these grounds? The next audience member said he was representing the millions of Americans who think that 9/11 was an inside job. He offered a number of examples that he presented as evidence for this view, including a copy of the 9/11 Commission report, which he presented to Naomi Klein. He then asked how Naomi Klein could refer to 9/11 as blowback if in fact it was an inside job carried out by the Bush administration.
I have the 9/11 Truth Commission, but thanks.
Look at it again.
Well, listen, I am not going to defend the 9/11 Truth Commission. It is an embarrassment of a report. And I do want to thank you for your contribution. And I absolutely have many questions. I also would put nothing past these guys. All I have said about this is that I report on what I can prove. And I can't prove it, so I'm not reporting on it. But I can prove that this administration invaded Iraq based on lies, illegally, and that act has led, by the latest respectable accounts, to the deaths of more than 1 million Iraqis. And I don't understand why that is not enough to impeach Bush and Cheney. I don't. I mean, I'm not. I mean, honestly, I know that the questions are real. But I also think that there's a deferral that goes on where it's like, if only we could prove this, if only we could prove that it was American lies. And I don't agree. Okay, I'm giving you my answer. Okay, so I would appreciate if you were respectful. You're next.
The next audience member asked about Naomi Klein's comments about being angry with those who say the Bush administration is incompetent, mentioning a conversation with her students about the usefulness of scorn as a position in this struggle, and asking if scorn offers a kind of detachment or complicity, and if there might be other identities or positions we might adopt, and if Ms. Klein had any thoughts about some right-wing Christian organizations that say democracy is evil and how that might fit in with this stance of detachment and scorn.
Yeah, just so people know, we have to end in 15. So, I think that your question, there was an earlier question about the incompetence and whether the sort of hardcore ideologue types like Grover Norquist, are they genuinely angry at the Bush administration for budgetary mismanagement? Are they really incompetent? And your question about scorn, I think, is really interesting. Scorn and I suppose ridicule would be another way of what you're referring to. And I tend to agree with you, or I think what you're suggesting, that there's something disempowering about the stance of just sort of laughing at this administration. And it is interesting that if we think about how much of the highest profile dissent satire now. And I'm a big fan of The Daily Show and Colbert, but I don't think it replaces, nor should it replace, a much more serious stance of disgust and rage, not just laughter. And it may very well be replacing it somehow, acting as some sort of a release. I think humor has to be part of any movement, but there's I think something different between sort of between the kind of humor I'm talking about and the ridicule and the constant ridicule, really. Because this is an administration that really deserves to be met with much more than just ridicule for these actions. And it doesn't create a space for a very seriously enraged response, or somehow makes that response seem ridiculous, a really deeply moral response. And but in terms of the incompetence, I don't believe that the true believers like Norquist really are all that mad at the Bush administration. Especially if we think about Norquist's collusion with Abramoff and how ready he was to be part of this kind of crony capitalist. I'm choosing my words carefully because he wasn't charged, but he was all over the Abramoff scandal. And what's happening at this moment is people are fleeing to their sacred texts because they are appalled by their creation. What happens when you have the most ideological government in history in terms of the willingness to really let the think tanks run the government, right? The hallways of the American Enterprise Institute echoed because they'd all been hired by this administration, right? And now they're upset because of overspending. So I don't give too much credence to this idea that the real ideologues are upset with the administration. I think that they're in an awkward situation, precisely because this administration welcomed them, followed so much of their advice, and the results are an indictment to the ideology. So what do ideologues do in that moment? Well, they say, well, they didn't apply the rules strictly enough, right? That's that's what fundamentalists do. Go back to fundamentals. But I don't really believe that this movement that we've been seeing, or this revolt of the elites, or this class war that I've been describing, really should be seen as primarily as an ideological project. I don't think it's ideology that fuels these policies. It's greed. And ideology serves as the cover story that makes that greed palatable, right? You're not really just trying to get incredibly rich. That's just an unfortunate side effect. What you are trying to do is actually help the most people possible through trickle-down economics, right? I don't buy it as a motivating force. I see it as a sort of cover story. Next question, please.
The next question had to do with the upcoming election and whether Naomi Klein had any advice for how to approach the campaigns. Another audience member asked if there would be a documentary about Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine. The next question asked if Naomi Klein had seen any of the evidence collected and published by David Ray Griffin that supports the view that 9/11 was an inside job. The next member of the audience to speak, referring to the trials of Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg, asked Naomi Klein why there had been no attempt to try the members of the Bush administration for war crimes. Another audience member asked whether the commercial media intentionally create confusion, putting us into a state of confusion, which is itself a form of shock. The next question was from a member of the local PDX Peace Coalition, asking Naomi Klein to sign the petition supporting the local campaign to make Portland, Oregon a sanctuary city for GI resistors for U.S. soldiers refusing to serve in Iraq.
Your very, very first signature will come from the daughter of a draft dodger. It's true. I am an American. I have dual citizenship. We came to Canada in 1967. I was born in Montreal, 1970. Where? Newark, New Jersey. That's where my dad's from. My mom's from Philadelphia. Well, we came because of the war, but we stayed because of the health care. There are a lot of questions. I'm going to finish this. Yeah, you can take it.
Finish it later.
Yeah, you got the idea. There was a lot there, but I think that would be an amazing response. And in Canada, we're having a really pitched battle right now. My family did come to Canada because we happened to have had a prime minister at the time that said that Canada should be a refuge from militarism. And we have a very different prime minister now. So it's really a battle whether the war resistors are going to be able to stay. And it's a really crucial piece of the struggle. I'm going to get through these questions now, and then we're okay. Yeah. The eugenics question is an interesting one. I'm not sure I have much to add. I mean, I don't think it's a huge part of it, but I think when push comes to shove, for a lot of the people we're talking about, you start to get some pretty ugly ideas about who deserves to survive, and it doesn't take much to get to that sort of language. It starts to emerge really, really quickly, including in New Orleans, like those people, they chose to live there and they can't take care of themselves, and so it starts to go down that road pretty quickly. I don't know why they haven't gone to The Hague. People have tried. There's been some incredible work, and the center, the CCR, Center for Constitutional Rights, and Michael Ratner and his whole team have just been absolutely incredible, real heroes, American heroes. But it's part of this, this process of, laying down an official truth. It matters. The point about how major change comes from shock, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I am not claiming that the idea of exploiting a disaster for political uses to get a political project through is something unique to this particular group of people. But I'm talking about a very anti-democratic use of crisis and shock. They didn't invent this either, but where you see it recurring are in the anti-democratic movements of the past. This is why it was a favorite fascist technique to use shock. When you don't have majority support for your political project, you have to use disasters and this idea of demobilizing the population and creating a crisis precisely because normal circumstances are not conducive to your project. Now, if we look at the progressive responses to the Great Depression or to natural disasters like the earthquake in Mexico in 1985 was a moment of democratization of the country, of people coming together. And I described something in Argentina which was very different. People responding to an economic crisis by coming together and demanding deeper democracy. You know, what happened in this country after the Great Depression was using a disaster, a crisis, to bring more people into the political process and to build a more equal country. It was a populist project. It was the opposite of what I'm describing, which is exploiting a crisis to get rid of the need to bring people into the political process. That was about using crisis to bring people in, and we have that option. But so even though, you know, I fully agree that we need to be ready when the next shock hits, we need to be ready now. I mean, I'm not sure how we're defining a disaster. I think we are living a disaster right now. And you know, what frightens me about it, and where I feel like we get into some really anti-human territory, is if we start to tell ourselves that it needs to get even worse than this, and then people will wake up. You know, I don't want to be part of any movement that desires more destruction than we're living right now. You know, we have to be guided. What separates us from what we are up against is that we value human life. We believe all lives are of equal value. If we go down that road, it's extremely dangerous territory. And, you know, I also don't see where the faith is that there is going to be this big wake-up shock. You know, if the drowning of an American city was not a wake-up shock on climate change and the destruction of the public infrastructure, come on, what exactly do people want? So it's really about our confidence. It isn't about the right shock. And the other thing I think we need to really understand is that people are responding to this shock. And they're responding to it in ugly ways, right? The backlash against immigrants in this country is about people's feeling of profound insecurity, right? Lou Dobbs goes on TV every night and talks about the war on the middle class, right? And he says a lot of really true things about what has happened to the middle class in this country. And when there is that rage and people see that inequality, there's two ways it can go, right? Up or down. And Lou Dobbs is there every night saying down, right? Push their rage down. And so if we, you know, have our marching orders, I think it's, you know, up. Push that rage up. But the urgency that I think we have to understand, you know, we're not dealing with a static situation. We're dealing with a situation where people are losing their homes, they're losing their pensions, they are terrified, and they are reacting. There is a racist backlash going on in this country. There's a rise in hate crimes going on in this country that is about people responding to this economic insecurity. And the fact that progressives don't have the courage to stand up in this moment and propose ways of responding to that insecurity that push the rage up where it belongs to the hedge fund managers and the people who are making super profits off of this moment is about, you know, we don't have anyone to blame but ourselves for that. I really don't think we do. And it's about unleashing, I think, some of that rage instead of scorn, perhaps, giving ourselves permission to be angry. The media, there's a question about media, and a very good question about the state of confusion that we're in, and you know, frankly, this is why I decided to write the book. I felt very confused and overwhelmed by how fast things were changing. I felt that our movement that we had built around, you know, I was very much a part of the protests against corporate globalization that were typified by the Seattle protests, but were much bigger than that. After 9/11, our movement lost its plot, and we lost our nerve as well. And you know, I wrote the book because I felt that we were bombarded with terrifying information, but we weren't making connections. And when we get all of this information thrown at us all the time, we stay precisely in that state of shock. We're bombarded with information, but no connections, no analysis, and that keeps us in exactly that immobility that we've really been stuck in. So when we gather and we tell ourselves stories, and this, I'm not claiming this is the story. I would never be so arrogant as to say it. But it's when we have those clicks of connection, then something happens to us. And I'm just going to. One of the loveliest things that happened to me since I finished the book is I sent the book to a hero of mine, John Berger. Some of you may know his writing. He wrote Ways of Seeing, and he's an incredible artist across many different mediums: fiction, nonfiction, painting. He's, I think, in his 90s now. He lives in France. And I sent him the book and asked him for a blurb, and he sent me this blurb. He was in a hotel in Paris, and he faxed it in handwritten. And he said that the book made him feel calm. And I got in this art. He said reading it instills a sense of calm. And it's so interesting because my publishers, we got in an argument about whether to include this quote on the book jacket because, they like quotes like terrifying, will scare the hell out of you, shocking, And then there's John Berger going, I felt calm. But, the truth is, this is what we want. We can't be effective activists from a point of hysteria, right? We can be calm and angry at the same time. But if we think about the effective political struggles of the past and our role models as activists, they weren't hysterical. They had that focus and that central calm. So when we make these connections between issues, between war and torture and economics, between our present and our past, our bodies start to relax, and we actually we calm down. We get more focused. We can actually feel some of that rage as opposed to just fear, and we can be much more effective activists, much more effective fighters.